Well, as one mentioned, my name is Ben Rolleman, and I'll just do a really brief introduction kind of about myself and the topic that I'm going to be discussing. I definitely appreciate that everybody has come and come to learn, and I really hope that kind of what I have to say adds to that pool of knowledge and really gives a different perspective. So I'm going to talk about transitioning from screen magnification to screen reading technology. So somebody who's really ultimately going blind. So my background is in everything accessibility, especially for the blind and low vision community. Just as a full disclosure, I'm going to take this more as a personal presentation. I'm going to draw from my experience and from the experience of others. I don't have any formal rehabilitation training. I'm not an expert in that. So there's probably experts who may disagree with what I have to say. I think most of it they would agree. But at the end of the day, everybody's unique, and this has been my experience and the experience of most people I've talked to. So two more things. I'm just going to fully say I am functionally blind. So that means I don't have any remaining sight. I used to have some sight, which is actually why I'm not putting up slides. I'm putting on the video just in case there's anybody with hearing loss who would benefit from the video. But otherwise, I'm aiming for a relatively non-visual experience, and that's on purpose because it's a different way of doing things, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to start off with a quick overview of kind of the different aspects of vision loss. I'm going to cover at a high level kind of the differences in screen magnifiers and screen readers, the two different types of technology. And finally, I'm going to talk about kind of my experience and the experience of others kind of making this transition. So first off, let's talk about a little bit of what it means to be kind of low vision or blind. So as I'm sure everybody knows, there's kind of two different categories here. So there's the whole blind category and the low vision. And in terms of the numbers, there's actually most people are in the low vision category. They still have some usable remaining sight with varying degrees, obviously, of perception. It's relatively few that are completely blind or next to completely blind. So really to highlight the two, total blindness is fairly easy to understand. If you kind of just close your eyes, look around, you don't really see anything. That's the general idea. Can't see anything. Low vision is quite a bit more complicated, and there's a lot more factors that go into it. So those factors, at least at a high level, are acuity. So this is your 20/20 vision or 2200 vision or 2400, whatever an individual happens to have. And that's really just an indicator of how far you can see. So that's when you go to the doctor and they put the characters on the screen and you have to read down the line and you see how far you get, and that determines that helps them figure out how much you can see. The second piece is visual fields. So this would be your field of view from left to right, up and down. How far can you see? So some people can't see very far out to the left and the right. Some people can't see up and down. Others can't see in the center, but can see on the periphery. So there's a lot of variation there, but that's generally what that is. Color perception. So this largely color blindness takes many forms. Depth perception. So this would be people who can't discern how far an object is from them. More of an issue with people who only have one functional eye or some neurological conditions. There's lots of variables there, of course. And finally, neurological effects. So this could be things where in these cases, typically the eyes themselves are working fine, but something's not wired correctly in the brain, either from birth or an accident, a stroke, something like that. So when somebody has vision loss, they will have at least one of those kind of aspects of vision impaired. So they might have more than one, probably have more than one, but they'll have at least one. And one thing to really note about being low vision is actually how confusing it can be. People typically with low vision often find their vision changes either throughout the day or just over time. And it actually is really hard to tell when you've lost some sight. Things don't just become black, they just disappear. It'd be easier if you just had a little black spot where something used to be, because then you'd know, okay, well, I'm missing something now. But things just typically don't exist. And I hope that'll tie in a little later when we're talking about the different technology and how the transition works. All right, so the first category of technology is called vision enhancement. So most people just can think of screen magnifiers for this, and generally that's true. But it does also include any settings that you can tweak on your digital system. So you can change your font size or your color, or maybe your mouse pointer, stuff like that. So any of that stuff also falls into this category. Anything where you adapt the visual interface to make it more accessible and easier to read for people with low vision. So screen readers have more than just magnification. They often have text enhancements. So this could include like anti-aliasing as you zoom in, highlighting different words where the focus is, stuff like that. They also typically do color enhancements. So this is kind of coming back to kind of the different aspects of having a visual impairment. People that have a hard time with color may not have the easiest time seeing the screen as it is. So this is where you can reverse the video, or you can add a color hue, or there's tons and tons of options usually in most screen readers to adjust this to make it easier to see. So there's focus enhancements. So this would include like putting a big circle around your mouse pointer or crosshairs, stuff like that. And definitely some magnifiers, in fact, most magnifiers do have some level of screen reading technology built in. Usually these are not intended to be used as full replacement screen reader type. They're more just to supplement the visual aspect of it, but some do include full screen readers built in. And yes, of course, they do magnify the screen. I did want to make a quick note about that because there's a common misconception about how the magnification levels work. So many people will see, references to, 2 times or 3 times or 4 times, which they're true, but it can be a little confusing to understand actually how that plays out. So when somebody says they're 2 times magnification, they're actually only seeing 25% of the screen. It's actually the inverse square of the power is the percentage of the screen. So 2 times power would be 1/4. And this is especially relevant when you start talking about 6, 8, 10 times magnification levels. I do know some people that are using magnification levels in and around that 12 to 16 times. I'm not really sure how they do it, but everyone's different, right? So the next category is vision replacement technology. So this is used for people who are totally blind like myself, or people who are usually fairly low vision, or people who just prefer to use an audio only type interface. These are generally considered screen readers, and they really kind of come in 2 different flavors. So you got your kind of more traditional desktop screen readers. This is a screen reader that doesn't make use of a touch screen. It's controlled entirely with a keyboard and just audio output or braille output. So they work by actually converting a 2-dimensional interface where you can look, left, right, up, and down into actually a very linear list. It's in a very linear structure. You go from one element to the next down the page. And by and large, the concept of a left and right doesn't really exist with this type of a screen reader. So mobile screen readers are a little bit different. They do tend to have a little bit more of the 2-dimensional aspect that sighted people would be used to. And to some degree, this is actually what makes them easier to learn. So you move your finger around the touch screen and it'll read the elements as you go over them. But even these will still use kind of a linear structure to go from one element to the next. And that is still commonly used despite having access to the 2-dimensional aspect, just simply because it's easier. So I'm going to go through a little bit more of my experience now that kind of got some of the background out of the way. So I actually started quite high functioning back when I was a kid. So I could see reasonably well, compared to what I can see now, not compared to someone who's fully sighted. So I could get away with just updating, the font size and the color and stuff just inside my operating system. And that was fine. But over time, I have a progressive eye condition. So that meant my eyes, gradually get worse over time. And I had to move to a screen magnifier. So I started to increase the magnification levels. I started to add some of the color and other focus enhancements. And eventually, over the years, I started to use some of the built-in screen reading features, which, especially for long documents and websites where, you quickly get tired visually. So at this point, this is when I kind of realized I had to make that switch, when I really found that as I was using my technology, that I was starting to really miss things. I couldn't find certain buttons. I was having a hard time following along with instructions. You check a tutorial online how to do something. And this really became a problem. And I really discovered that even simple tasks, finding the send button on your email suddenly becomes more difficult. And it's gradual, so it's hard to even tell it's happening, but it does, and it becomes more difficult. I also found that definitely over the last year or two that I was using my eyes to use the computer, I got a lot more headaches, got very fatigued, very high levels of eye strain, bad posture, all those things that go with really struggling with accessing the computer. But that being said, coming to that realization took quite a bit of time, and it was not an easy switch. Because really what we're coming down to is we're completely changing the way you're using a computer. You're moving from a two-dimensional view to a linear view. You're moving from a visual thing that a visual view that you've been using for your entire life to an entirely audible one. Further to that, it's not as simple as you just move the mouse pointer and click on things anymore. Now there's hundreds of keyboard shortcuts for the operating system, for the screen readers, and it can be really hard to know where to start. There is a fair bit of training, but the reality is too, when you're in a position where you need to use the technology to access it, it can create a little bit of a chicken and the egg problem. So there is an element of confusion, and it definitely makes it quite difficult to at least get started. Definitely part of this change too is above and beyond just a complete change of interface and lots of keyboard shortcuts. To really get efficient with a screen reader, it is really advantageous to actually have a fairly high level of technical knowledge. So this would be understanding how different applications are coded, understanding how different elements on the page work. So generally, a set of people don't need to know that as much, but screen reader users need to know what a combo box is and how it works and how to use the keyboard to use it. They need to know like what a heading is supposed to do and how to utilize it and how to jump to it. These are all things that go into efficient navigation. And a lot of this does actually come down to creative thinking. Sometimes you're looking for stuff on a page that isn't the best laid out for a linear view. And you have to think about what's around it, and you're searching for buttons, or you could search for specific text. So there's an element of creative thinking that goes into just quickly navigating through a page. But there's also another piece. So that's the technical stuff. That's probably enough to get anybody a little bit worried who's thinking about making that switch. But there's also an emotional and psychological piece. So in a way, when you make this switch and you make this decision, it's actually, in a way, you're almost saying, I'm blind. I'm losing the sight. I've had a little bit, and now it's gone. And that can be very, very challenging for most people. Especially if you grew up with some sight and you lose it over time, even though it's not, perfect, it's all you have, and you kind of value it. And when it's giving up on it, it can be very difficult. And definitely, as you do finally make that decision and start to learn, then you're going to start to hit the technical barriers, and it'll feel like absolutely everything is fighting you. So there's nothing that's going to work well. Nothing's easy. Even something as simple as, oh, how do I shut my computer off? Suddenly it's like, I'm not sure. And you have to figure out every little basic thing. And it really can slow you down, at least at first. And it kind of, in a way, can be an alienating experience too, because now you're using your computer or your phone in a way that's completely different to most other people. And especially if you start reaching out and looking on YouTube and stuff, you're going to find all these YouTube videos of these other screen reader users who are just flying. They know what they're doing great. In a way that can almost be a discouragement. It's not that people can't reach those levels, but it's kind of not well known that it took them years to get there. And, you know, there's that huge learning curve you still have to get through. So when, you know, those types of things can sometimes be unhelpful, especially if people are don't have that knowledge in mind. And really what it comes down to is patience and perseverance to push through and to learn the technology. I'm going to make a quick note about kind of inaccessible sites. These actually are really troublesome when you're learning, because now you're going onto a website and you're getting confused. You're not sure what to do in many cases, simply because your technology, you just don't know your technology well enough yet. But if you throw in a whole bunch of inaccessible code and things that are not done correctly, this can actually make it even more confusing, because now you're not sure if there's an error on the site, or if it's something you just don't know. The next thing that I want to talk about in terms of making this transition is actually how most people do it, at least at first. So what they do is they'll actually try and use their screen reader and magnifier together. And this can work. It's not the end of the world. It's especially useful for learning some of the basics. But at the end of the day, it is actually better to learn the reader on its own, at least from my experience. Reality is, if you're low vision and you know you're making this transition, you're still going to be more comfortable using your eyes. So you're going to cheat. When something gets tricky with a screen reader that you're trying to learn, you'll just cheat and you'll look with your eyes, which kind of will hold you back on actually learning how to do it fully with a screen reader. So I tried it. It didn't work for me. It took me a while to figure that out, but I definitely found that it was helpful. And it's very common that people do get stuck there with that. So towards the end, for me, I was using ZoomText at 6x magnification. So there's a lot of debate, especially amongst the experts, about what is the point when someone should kind of give up on using a screen magnifier. And a lot of them say 8x. From my experience and from talking to a lot of other people, 6x is definitely a place to start at least thinking about it, if that's something you or someone you know is going through. To me, because it's such a personal thing and because it depends on the person, I think a better indicator of when to switch is actually your frustration levels, your headaches, your fatigue, those types of effects. So if you have those, for individuals that have those when they're using their technology, then that's a good sign that perhaps that technology is simply just not working. So for me, I definitely found there was a lot of benefits to switching. I obviously got rid of the headaches and fatigue, better posture. I actually found, at first you do slow down because you're trying to learn everything from scratch, but I found even within the first week, I was already faster using audio only. And in some cases, actually, screen readers are faster, even than people with full sight with no visual impairment. Especially as you get to the higher speeds with the screen reader, you can read large documents and pages very, very quickly. So hopefully you can kind of see, just as we went through some of this stuff, how it might relate to some of the accessibility standards and like the success criteria in WCAG. There's definitely lots of stuff about the low vision. You can see all the different aspects, color and organization, and visual fields would affect things, how things are laid out. This affects not just the success criteria, but also just general usability. You can see when we're talking about different types of assistive technology, we're not talking about the website itself will not provide the adaptation per se. It'll only facilitate the assistive technology to make the adaptation for the user. And this is a really powerful thing because the user will have their assistive technology set up the way they like it. They'll have their voice set up to the speed they want it. They'll have, the colors often they'll have their own color filters. But if things are not accessible right from the beginning, then that'll cause quite a bit of chaos. I just want to highlight again, yes, definitely the inaccessibility of websites is really troublesome for beginners, but it's still extremely important, even for advanced users, like myself. We rely on this technology to move fast, to be productive, to be efficient, and so it is possible to work around certain inaccessible accessible components on a website, but those are definitely not substitutes for true native accessibility. That's that is done when you build a very accessible, inclusive digital resource. All right, so I'm just going to wrap this up, and then we'll open up for questions. So really using the computer, it's a completely different interface. It's site versus no site, audio versus no audio. It's completely different, and that alone is a big enough technical challenge to get people concerned. But it's also the technology and making the change in terms of the emotional and psychological aspect is definitely very, very hard for many people. Many people actually get stuck trying to make the switch, sometimes even for years. So it's not an easy task by any means. And definitely, when you have inaccessible websites, as many of them are, this definitely does not help with the transition and making it any easier. Not sure how much time we have left. I think we've got a few minutes, but I'm happy to take any questions that people might have.
Excellent, Ben. Thank you so much.